Well, hello everyone. So some of you are coming back clearly. I can see your names, and some of you are joining us for the first time. So welcome to all. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Benjamin. He is the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and we are so excited to co-sponsor this event with them today. So prior to joining the Dickey Center, and he joined the Dickey Center in 2012. I vividly remember that day when you came in and said hello, Dan. He served as an ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism at the US State Department. In that position, he was the principal advisor to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, on counterterrorism. He was also a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies and director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. He has written extensively on terrorism, US foreign policy, and international affairs. He co-wrote The Age of Sacred Terror in 2002, which was awarded the Arthur Ross Prize of the Council on Foreign Relations. He began his career as a journalist and held positions in Germany as the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and as a correspondent for the Time magazine. So he holds degrees from Oxford and Harvard, so he's smart. Let's welcome Dan Benjamin.
Well, thank you very much, Sadhna, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a melancholy event to do so with an empty, rocky classroom, unfortunately, but we're all doing the best we can under the circumstances. What you didn't add, Sadhna, is this is probably my last Dartmouth event since I'm leaving Dartmouth at the end of the month to become the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I am thrilled that I can do as my final event, a joint Dickey-Rocky event, because we worked so well for so long. And it's really been a pleasure to work with the terrific staff of the Rockefeller Center. So as I said, I want to thank you for having me. And let me begin by saying that I feel like I'm giving the wrong talk today. I think in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and the dramatic events across the country in recent days, I really need to acknowledge that that is the most compelling issue of the day, the use of violence against people of color and the unequal treatment of Americans of different races. And relatedly, the mishandling of this crisis, I might add, by the Trump administration. And I'm happy to try to say something thoughtful about this in the Q&A, but I confess that right now I find myself somewhat dumbstruck by the evil that's been perpetrated by public servants. And I'm also unsure of what I can add to the torrent of commentary that has come forth. Additionally, the issue of globalization is one that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is an artifact or a consequence of our globalized world, and I think that it will continue to be one of the really big issues that we will need to engage with in the months and years ahead. So I hope that you will tolerate the fact that I'm talking about that and not what's going on in our cities across the country. So I'm sure everyone here knows exactly what globalization is. And I'll just say in passing that we mean by that term the accelerating transit of goods, capital, ideas, and people across borders because of technology's advances and because of political openness since the end of the Cold War we have been globalizing beyond the wildest dreams of any other era in human history. This phenomenon has created untold wealth for the global community, but it has not been shared as equitably as it should have been. It has to be admitted, raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, many of them in China, but also in other countries. And the globalization of knowledge and the accompanying revolution involving computers has provided the basis for technological advances that really are beyond the imagination and astound us every single day. It's as I said, the benefits of globalization haven't been fairly distributed, and as a result, at the same time that we have this abundance of progress, we have a global crisis of inequality. It's not the only crisis that globalization has brought. In an earlier life, when I was focusing primarily on terrorism, I argued that 9/11 was one such crisis, as individuals with violent ideology exploited the possibilities of modern travel and technology to carry out enormous harm. The financial crisis of 2007 and 8 was also a crisis of globalization, and in this case of international capital, and it has had lasting effects on the global economy. I think we'd have to admit that in comparison with COVID-19, those were serious episodes, but perhaps not quite of the same scale, although the after effects of 9/11 certainly had profound impacts globally. I think the question before us is whether the pandemic has really thrown the brakes on globalization in a way that none of those earlier crises did, or at least not in a lasting way. And are we headed towards a period in which we will see a reversal in terms of international travel, capital flows, trade, and intellectual exchange? So on the first one, I think pretty much everyone who's watching this has a pretty good idea that we are not going to see travel along the lines of what we used to routinely encounter. International air traffic now is down by roughly 90%. And even once there is a vaccine, and that's not a certainty, but I think it's a likelihood, even once there is a vaccine, I think that it is by no means certain that people will want to get on planes as much as they used to, because as this event demonstrates, we've found technological workarounds, and they may not be as satisfying as being in personal contact, but they are good enough. And if you imagine, by the way, what would have happened if we'd had the COVID-19 crisis in, say, 1985, it's really quite a thought experiment. All education would have ground to a halt. There would have been no way to keep ourselves going. But I do think that there's also now a recognition that pathogens like the novel coronavirus can find their way around the world with remarkable rapidity thanks to international travel connections, and that that is probably not a one-off. If you delve into the literature of public health, if you look, for example, at the after-action report the White House did after the Ebola crisis of 2014 through 16, I think it is well known, and it should have been well recognized before, that there are lots of pathogens out there that want to hop on planes and take off into the friendly skies. And this is going to be a problem that stays with us, and that really can't be wished away. I think people will travel again, and I think they will travel in good numbers, but I do think that we are probably heading into a different era than what we've all experienced in the last decade or two. As for trade and finance, I think we know that global trade, or I think the predictions are global trade this year will be down as much as a third, which is really almost unimaginable. Foreign direct investments going to be down about 40%. Now, there's nothing that says we can't bounce back from that, or at least bounce back slowly over time. But I think that a sober assessment would demonstrate that the crisis has illustrated the peril of what has come to be known as just-in-time production and of global supply chains, which can be fragile and present a kind of catastrophic situation for firms when whole countries shut down. And this is something that our business leaders are going to be looking at very closely as they try to diversify supply chains, simplify them where possible, and perhaps bring them geographically closer. I think a lot is going to depend on how governments react, and especially our government. Right now, the pandemic has illustrated some serious shortcomings in our public health system, and specifically, as everyone who's had any contact with the news will recognize, some problems having to do with PPE, personal protective equipment, and medication. And we've seen how dependent we are on other countries for PPE production. And we also know that most of the world's medication is made, even if the research is done here in Western Europe. Most of those pills and vials are made in China and in India. And I think that policymakers across the political spectrum are not going to feel comfortable about letting that continue to be the case. So it's not surprising that we've heard from Jared Kushner and from White House advisor Peter Navarro that this needs to change. And I think that we are going to see, whoever is elected in the fall, a certain amount of what has been called reshoring. Okay, instead of offshoring, will be reshoring. So that alone is not going to upend globalization or throw the machine into reverse, but it comes in the context of an increasing exclusion of foreign firms from investment in sensitive industries in the US. Sometimes that's highly justifiable. I would say right now, without having reviewed every single one of the cases, that we as a nation are showing a high level of sensitivity to these national security issues. And it comes also in a context of increasing political tension, especially between the US and China. We're all aware of the crescendo of stress in the relationship. We've seen trade sanctions, or really a trade war. We've seen efforts by the administration to accuse China of being responsible for what it calls the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, even the circulation of rumors and innuendo suggesting that this was a release, probably accidental, from a Wuhan lab. That's a scenario that has largely been discounted by our own intelligence community, but the fact that anyone has made that argument, I think, is indicative of their mindset right now and the desire to use the current crisis as an opportunity to score points, both in domestic political opinion and globally. And on top of all that, now we have the Hong Kong crisis, which is also going to have lasting effects on our relationship with China. There is a lot of talk in Washington about decoupling, about disentangling our economy from China's. And that, it has to be said, would be a really big deal in terms of throwing globalization into reverse. If we are dividing up the world into different spheres, then that is a very perilous activity, and that would have profound implications for American manufacturing and also for the exchange of knowledge, which has been the basis of so many of our achievements. Now, in saying all that, I'm not making any claims that Chinese practices in terms of intellectual property and the like aren't highly problematic. They are. They need to be challenged. I think both parties are determined to do so. But it's important to remember that if we start pulling out lots of production, we will also see an increasing exclusion from Chinese markets. And I think the American business community would be pretty horrified by that. We should also be clear, it's not just China. The C-19 pandemic has witnessed some pretty incredible tensions and jostling among long-term allies. It's seen the US try to lure away a promising vaccine producer from Europe in the belief that the United States had to have exclusive control of the ultimate vaccine production. It has seen us try to prevent the export of PPE and other US products to foreign consumers who paid for it. This has led to the kind of unprecedented situation in which a US company, 3M, has defied the US government on issues about exports because of its commitment to free trade. And of course, it's worth noting as well that when the Europeans tried to put together a big conference, and indeed did put together a very important conference on a global vaccine effort, the United States astonishingly did not participate. It's also worth noting that we seem to be on our way out of the World Health Organization. So there's a lot of creaking going on in the international system and a lot of worry about a deteriorating global order. I think it's notable as well that the Council on Foreign Relations just this last week or so published a major report on what it calls the end of the world order. One other thing we shouldn't overlook is that migration is right up there among the hottest of hot button issues. And the administration was well in gear in terms of closing and curtailing migration and immigration into the United States in a very far-reaching, unprecedented sort of way, and that it has used the COVID-19 crisis to essentially halt all immigration into the U.S. And that, it has to be said, is also a bad sign for globalization, even while recognizing that illegal migration is one of the big challenges of a globalized world. So what's to be done? A lot will depend on elections in the fall. I don't think there's any question but that we will have two parties that are on two different sides of this issue. I don't think anyone is going to endorse the kind of go-go globalization we had in the 90s, globalization that has basically no provisions to protect the elements in the population that tend to be most seriously disadvantaged by globalization. I think that certainly will be an important part of the democratic platform, but I do think that there will be a fundamentally different approach to the phenomenon overall. I would just say that I think it's really important to keep in mind that globalization has been a perpetual challenge for policymakers. One of the jobs I held a long time ago was a speechwriter for President Clinton in the early days of globalization. And even back then, we went to enormous pains to try to figure out ways to explain to the American public about the benefits of globalization, because it seemed like the loudest noises one heard were from those who were feeling that they were being victimized by it. So this is always going to be a challenge, but at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that globalization really has benefited us in enormous ways for a long time. And I think it's worth ending, on a positive note and saying that the crisis is real, the crisis is profound, and by that I mean the COVID-19 crisis, but I think it's also an extraordinary opportunity for greater collaboration of the kind that has produced the best of globalization. Scientific cooperation, international economic cooperation, especially of the kind that corrects those flaws in the distribution of social goods. We will need an enormous amount of global cooperation to deal with the effects of the pandemic in the developing world. There has been a lot written. We've been focusing on our own problems, but there has been an increasing amount written on the impact that COVID-19 is likely to have in the Southern Hemisphere in the months ahead as the weather turns warmer there. And that is simply not a task that can be left to chance. We need global cooperation to deal with that and to deal with the unbelievably challenging economics of the moment and the effort to restore growth around the world. So we have rivals and we have competitors, and it's important to remember that we have a lot of friends around the world, and that this is a time when we should be working ever more closely with those friends in particular, and finding places where we can cooperate with our rivals, including on scientific cooperation to bring online the vaccines and the medicines that we need. We have seen how trade, investment, and the movement of people can enrich lives, and I really and truly believe that this is a moment for common action. And I think I am going to stop there, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We've got some started, but I just would like to remind people that you can either go to the bottom of your screen and raise your hand through the participants button, or you can send us questions in chat. Dan has a question about the GOP. He says the GOP is very sensitive to big business. Wouldn't big business seriously resist limiting free trade with China, as so many of their products are made there?
Yes, it's a good question. And it's one that I have to say I have been puzzled about for the last 18 months, as we've seen the escalation of tensions over trade with China. And the Chamber of Commerce is always a very good bellwether, and they certainly have been critical of some of the steps that the administration has taken. It remains to be seen. How confrontational it'll get, because the business community has also been highly appreciative of the tax cuts that the administration has given it. So in general, the administration has tilted more towards a populist approach, certainly in rhetoric and sometimes also in policy, and we'll see how it goes from here.
Ambassador Benjamin, Gavin has a question, and I'm going to ask him to start his video and unmute. Oops.
Hello. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I want to thank you for taking the time today, first off. And then second off, I was wondering, do you think there's a possibility for global cooperation on sort of like a public health inspections like setup, sort of like how the IAEA works for nuclear inspections? Do you see any possibility of something like that? Of like a team going into an area, like a nonpartisan, non-national team that goes in and sees what's going on and reports about it?
Well, that's what the WHO does when it's dealing with cooperative countries. And I think it's unlikely that anyone will ever allow those kinds of inspections on a completely unlimited basis. You know, countries take their sovereignty seriously. But you know, when it is working well, that is what the WHO does. And you know, I think that there's a high premium on international cooperation just to maintain those kinds of things. I assume you're talking primarily just about, you know, ordinary health situations, and not investigating whether someone's complying with the Biological Weapons Convention, which does have monitoring measures involved in it. But I think, yeah, the WHO, you know, is all over the world doing that kind of work. And that's another reason why it would be such an enormous mistake if we left. I think it's clear that we do need much more health surveillance in the world. But you know, it's not completely broke. It should be fixed.
Okay, yeah, because I remember there were reports early on in January about a sort of virus in Wuhan. I was wondering, like, was the WHO there, or was China the only one sort of monitoring this?
Right. So the accusation is that the Chinese were not fully forthcoming with their information on the level of infection and what was going on. And I think that it's clear that it wasn't the kind of transparency we would like. But at the same time, you know, anyone who was expecting China to have full transparency either was engaging in kind of straw man building, or you know, had an axe to grind already. I don't think we should let the Chinese off for what they did, but I also don't think that we should, as the old saying goes, cut off our nose to spite our face.
Okay, thank you.
Ambassador Benjamin, I've got a combo question from two different folks. One was wondering what the effects / impact will be if Donald Trump gets reelected, and then the flip side of that is what would globalization look like in a Biden administration?
Well, so my crystal ball is anything but clear, but I think that the president has shown that he believes in a powerful nation that throws its weight around to get its goals and to achieve its aims. And I think that we would be likely to see more in the way of trade wars. My class was speaking with a Europe expert the other day who reported that Europeans completely expect a trade war if the president is reelected. And it's something that he has threatened many times. In addition, I think there'd be a further erosion of our engagement in international organizations, which are really a big part of our engagement around the world, but also, you know, just the globalization machine. So if you're not, I mean, the administration recently, I think, withdrew from the international, I can't remember the exact name of it, but essentially the International Postal Union. If you're going to do that kind of thing, I think you're kind of voting with your feet on globalization. So it remains to be seen, and but I wouldn't say I'm hugely optimistic about a change of tack. I think that you know, Vice President Biden is a committed internationalist. I think he also will be concerned about not having lots of vital medicines and PPE produced in the U.S. And I think he's going to be a zealous defender of national security, and so we'll continue to support the CFIUS process, as it's called in Washington, that decides who can invest in our sensitive technologies, from telecoms to weapon systems to power generation to what have you. But I think that he will be a strong believer that you know, we hang together or we hang separately, and that has been, you know, the dominant trend in American foreign policy since 1945. And I think it's served us very well.
Well, continuing on with Joe Biden, I'm going to ask you to put on your seer hat or take out your crystal ball, because Kristen wants to know if there's any chance that Biden will select Susan Rice as his VP candidate, and is that more likely now than it was 8 days ago, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so Susan is a good friend, and so I would be thrilled if he chose her. I would say as a betting man, I wouldn't have put her at the top of the list. I think that there is a strong preference in electoral politics for picking people who are involved in electoral politics. And so he said he's going to pick a woman. That narrows the field by about 50%. And I think, or more rather, because he's going to pick someone I think who is, you know, a working politician. So Susan, I know is, you know, has been put on the list. That's been out, and I wish her all the best. And she was great when she was here last winter. I wouldn't have said she was the front runner.
Okay. Rich wants to know, since capitalism is one of the primary drivers of globalization, wouldn't it seem to be fairly safe? Tax cuts are a Band-Aid, not a long-range business plan, right?
So I'm not an economist, and I'll leave it to the economists to pronounce on that. You know, we have, historically speaking, a low tax burden, and yet we have enormous responsibilities and we have galloping debt. You know, I'm not sure that tax policy is the first thing that we need to change right now, especially with so many people out of work and so many firms that need support. You know, I think we're hanging with capitalism, but this is a unique situation.
There's also a question from Huntley about Huawei, and are they a danger to our security if we deal with them?
So Huawei has been on the screen of the national security community in Washington for more than a decade. And the government has, on numerous occasions under different administrations, made the case that Huawei, buying Huawei equipment, especially during our transition to 5G, threatens the security of a lot of our information, and that there's an intelligence collection problem there. And I'm inclined to agree, although I'm not a technical expert on this.
With the increased, and yes, I want to apologize for mispronouncing Huawei. I did know that, but anyway. With the increased importance of the World Bank and the IMF helping developing countries cope with COVID, do you think the administration will lessen its skepticism towards them, particularly on the funding part?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I tend to think that we are not going to see enormous increases in the amount of money that is appropriated for the international financial institutions in the remainder of this administration, that is between now and January 20th. The administration, you know, has been famously skeptical of all kinds of international assistance, and I kind of doubt that's going to change. I would just underscore one thing, and that is whether you look backward in time and your eye catches either a Republican or a Democratic administration, that administration and or, you know, that constellation of individuals in a set of circumstances like this would be playing an international leadership role. And we are not right now. And that I find sad, because the United States alone has the wherewithal to organize the kinds of assistance that the developing world will need. Even lots of middle income countries are going to be sorely stretched by COVID-19. And this is, to my mind, a very depressing situation. So I'm not sure I see the financial institutions getting a lot more love right now, maybe a little more. The fact is, I think most close watchers are still pleased that there hasn't been more undermining of those institutions in recent years.
Well, here's a question that sort of is related to that, slightly different, but would any country, WHO dropouts perhaps, use a COVID vaccine as a bargaining chip to bully other countries?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. It's a simple answer. I think the norms that we had developed after 45 suggest that the vaccine should be distributed as widely as possible, regardless of the political stripe of other countries. I think in the environment we're in now, that's a little harder to imagine. Although it has to be said, there are real soft power gains to be made by being a country that gets there first and that takes a responsible approach towards distributing it widely. I think that is going to be one of the really interesting developments over the next year, assuming we're fortunate enough to get a vaccine that soon.
I think we're just about out of time, so I will ask you this one last question, but I didn't know if there was also room for time, if we had time, because there was a little sassy comment from one of your colleagues about maybe shaving, but
well, I just want to say to Professor Muirhead, who is taking the opportunity of having a successor at Rocky to act irresponsibly and glibly in this sort of situation. I just wanted to say to him that for me, it's one of the great moments in my life that I have enough beard that anyone can notice on Zoom, since that hasn't always been the case. I don't have a thick beard, but for me, one of the high points of the last week was when I could finally get a haircut again on June 1 in Vermont. Otherwise, this could have been a really grotty experience. Life is coming back to normal, so that's all good. I see that one more message has come back, and yes, it's Professor Muirhead congratulating me on my scraggly beard. I'm going to miss the collegiality of Dartmouth tremendously. What more can I say?
Well, we'll finish up with this one last question about, again, Vice President Biden. If he's elected, do you think we should, or should we rejoin the Iran weapons treaty, the impact on NATO and climate change?
Wow, that's a short answer, a short question
in 2 minutes.
End on. So, for my money, it was a mistake to leave the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. It will be very challenging to re-enter because the Iranians will want some compensation for the problems that they have, the economic damage that they have suffered due to American sanctions. And in addition, we are close, on the timeline. The JCPOA has timelines of 10 and 15 years, and we've moved way down those timelines, and we're getting closer to the period when they would be released from any strictures, and that's going to be a matter of some uneasiness for a new administration. That said, I think we should jump in with both feet to negotiate a modified deal and get this done and get the best deal that we can. The vice president speaks for himself on the other issues. Climate change, he's determined to be a leader on it. I think that people now know what it's like to, feel being tremendously affected by things in your environment. I mean, COVID-19, my God, if this doesn't change how we feel about the world we live in, I don't know what will. There was one other big elephant in that pack, along with the JCPOA, climate change. What was the third one?
the Iran weapons treaty, the impact on NATO and climate change.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah. So, I mean, the vice president is a historic supporter of NATO and the transatlantic relationship, and I would expect that there will be a lot of emphasis on mending ties with our friends in Europe from the get-go. You know, it's not my goal to be a partisan in here, but I'm really just trying to relate what I think are the different positions on these issues.
Well, thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Sadhna.
Dan, thank you so much, and thank you so much for beginning this entire talk with so much compassion and talking about the world, the strange world in which we live. So we really appreciate the depth with which you went into different topics very fast, and we thank the Dickey Center for co-sponsoring this particular event with us. Sadly, this is our last event for the spring term, but I am so delighted that we will be back in the fall with some more events for you. Please do join us at that time. Dan, I wish you all the best again. When you go to the American Academy, we will be thinking about you and we will miss you.
Well, all I can say is I look forward to coming back to the end of social distancing so I can give you and my other friends a hug, hello or goodbye. It's been great working together, and I look forward to seeing you in Berlin too.
Thank you. We will take you up on that.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks very much.